Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 3, and this is pretty much about the newborn and what can newborns do or not do, and a little bit about how we physically develop and some of our perception and motor skills. Newborns are born with reflexes, and the reflexes tend to fall into two categories. Those that we have for survival values, such as rooting and suckling and eye blinking. If we didn't know how to do those kind of coming out of the womb, we might have trouble surviving. Babies who don't know how to suckle are a good example of babies who have a lot of trouble surviving. Other reflexes may be ones that we need to have to begin to learn how to do other things. So a great example is this reflex we have that we put a baby's feet down, they pick them up right away. They pick them up right away. And that seems to be a precursor to being able to walk, learning how to lift one's leg. So they tend to be there for two basic reasons. Reflexes are also very important to us in the healthcare industry because it really begins to show us the health of the child. The better the nervous system is, the better the reflexes are. We're going to want to measure those abilities as soon as they're born, and there's a couple of different ways that we assess newborns. Virginia Abgar created one of the more popular ones. It's called the Abgar scoring system. Now please ignore that little 2. I don't know why that's there. But basically we rate them on 5 different things: heart rate, respiration, muscle tone, reflexes, and skin tone. And this would be basically a chart that you'd be given. And you'd be giving them from 0, 1, or 2 points depending on how they react. The total points tells us a lot about a child. Now the magic number is 7. We'd like to get a 7 or better, and then we know the child is in excellent condition. If they get anything less than a 7, it's probably going to mean that they're going to need some sort of follow-up, more examination, something that may need to be at least looked at. If it's really low, down around 0, 3, then we have a child who's in distress. While the Abgar is very popular, there are other assessment tools, including the NBAS, or the Needle Behavioral Assessment Scale. Now, this one does use 28 different behavioral things that they're looking at, but what's different about this one versus the Abgar is that this one's really looking at your state of mind, your alertness, and your social interactions with other people. How do you interact? And you might say, well, newborns don't interact. Well, yeah, they do. They interact, and does stimulus affect them, and other aspects like that. As far as states, newborns basically have 4 different states that they are. We have the alert and active, and with the alert and active, you can see this child is looking at this particular person, they're studying them, they're wondering what's going on. We also have the waking active, where we're awake and we're active, but we're not really looking at anything in particular. We seem to be unfocused. We have these uncoordinated movements. Don't pretend like nothing's going on here. It's just simply we're not as attentive right now. We may be just processing information going on around us, or maybe we're just digesting. Crying is a state that I don't think I need to say too much about. Most people know what crying is, and sleeping is one that most parents would hope their child would do for more than a few hours at a time. We also have 3 basic cries when we are very little, and we are talking about infants here: basic cry, the mad cry, and the pain cry. Now we do know when children get older that they're going to have different cries than this. We are talking about the infant. Although my pictures are a little older than infants, I've picked them for a very specific reason. The basic cry is kind of soft, it builds in volume, the child is hungry, you know, we see sort of that face like this. But the mad cry tends to be more intense and louder, and one of the differences between this cry and this cry is look at the forehead right here. This one is not very wrinkled. Here, this child has got these eyebrows pushed together. You can see this is much more of a mad face than this is. This is a pissed off little baby. Pain cries are a totally different thing. Now, one thing about pain cries is that even though it says it starts loud and it's followed by gasping, we can also have pain cries that are quiet, meaning is that they absolutely have no volume coming out of them. They are in pain, and it's a silent cry, just a big empty hole. And they still will gasp, though, in between those big empty hole breaths. We would love babies to sleep a lot, and they do sleep a lot. In fact, they sleep 16 to 18 hours a day. Our only problem is that newborns only sleep about 3 hours at a given time, which is why most parents of newborn babies look exhausted. About every 3 hours, they wake up for an hour and they want to eat. Why? Because it's that first year that we are growing so much. So we sleep, we eat. As I like to say, we coo, we poo, that's all we do. By 3 to 4 months, we are in a little bit longer cycle. We'll get 5 to 6 hour cycles, which is really nice. And by 6 months, we are sleeping hopefully through most of the night. And that's when parents begin to become less zombied. What is very fascinating is that newborns spend most of their time in REM sleep, about 50% of their time. Now, that's unusual because as we get older, that REM sleep goes down. And if you don't remember what REM is, that's rapid eye movement. And it's during rapid eye movement that we have most of our vivid dreams. So why are newborns having such vivid dreams? Well, if you remember from Introduction to Psychology, that first cycle of sleep tends to be our processing dreams. So one of the hypotheses is that newborns are just processing a lot of what they're seeing throughout their day or what they've been exposed to so far. After all, they've had 9 months, but it's been a very protected 9 months in that mother's womb. And when we come out, all of a sudden, these sights and sounds and touches and feels, these are all new to us. So all of that needs to be processed in our very small little brains. Now, temperament is basically a dimension of personality. And one thing we know is that our temperament tends to be there from the moment we're born. Now, don't confuse this with temper. Temper is angry and all this. Temperament tends to be one of many different things. Now, as it says here, there's a debate on how many there are, and we're not going to argue how many there are. But I do like to look at Rothenbach, who looked at 3 dimensions of children's temperaments or newborns' temperaments. And the first thing is, are these happy, active, vocal babies? Are they kind of extroverted, or they tend to be more quiet and less active? Those are more introverted babies. And you can see that pretty much from the moment that a newborn is born. Then we have what they call the negative affect type of temperament, and that's anger, fear, frustration, shy. These are children who are not easy to be soothed. They scream and cry a lot. And the last one they look at is your effort to control. How much are they controlling their impulses at this area? How much are they distractible? And these are all things that tend to stay with us sort of throughout our lifetime. A question people often have is how much does our heredity versus our environment contribute to our temperament? And the studies they did were on twins. Now, there are 2 types of twins, if you don't know. There's identical twins, which means one egg is split, and there are fraternal twins, which have 2 separate eggs but gestate at the same time. Now, in our twin studies, we found that identical twins, because they tend to share the same DNA, tend often to have very similar temperaments, much more than fraternal twins do. But what we do find is that heredity tends to be more on that negative effect than any other temperament dimension. So the ones where we said that they tend to be shy or quiet or reserved. We also know that heredity tends to contribute to temperament much more during childhood than infancy. So when they're babies, we don't find heredity to be as much of a contributing aspect. We also find that things change over time. So when we looked at this, the question was, well, we have this little baby who's been born. How stable is this temperament? Are we going to change a great deal as we grow up? And we do find is that they tend to be somewhat stable from infancy through adulthood. And then after adulthood, we do find that we might have some changes. Basically, what we're talking about is that just because I have a temperament one way doesn't mean that I'm going to be guaranteed to have that temperament always. Parents, however, can influence their child's temperament as they grow. And what we're really talking about here is maybe helping the child to either become more extroverted if they're too introverted, or maybe get more control or learn how to control their impulses. It doesn't mean we can have enormously shaping our child and make them a totally different person, but we do have some ability to go ahead and help a little bit with how that outcome may come. Now, growth is something that we need to understand. Growth in psychology or developmental psychology is basically talking about the bones and the muscles, where the use of the bones and muscles is more about maturation. So, growth is very rapid, we know, in the beginning than any other time in our childhood. And we know that by the time a kid is a year old, they generally have tripled their weight. We will never triple our weight in 1 year again. The other thing we need to understand that average is not the same as normal. And so what they mean by average is right here, this red line on this growth chart is sort of the 50% mark. And most people say, well, that's the average child. Well, that's not really the average child. It is the middle between the ranges. But our thing is that we can have a child of the same age who have tremendously different height variances. So if you happen to have a child whose ethnicity is one that tends to be toward the more petite side, such a Vietnamese heritage is often a very petite person, versus somebody from an area of Africa that's very tall, you're going to see two kids who are basically the same age who are going to have tremendously different height as far as who they are. Now, this can somewhat be a problem for the child because you can look here and say, let's say that we're right here at this height, but we are this age. So this is, if I kind of scoot down, this is 21 months, but we're this tall. So what could happen is that people could actually think that this poor 12-month-old is actually 21 months old. So they could actually misunderstand the age of a child. This can happen both ways. Children who are slightly more on the shorter side, you might want to say, might be often viewed as being younger than children who are on the taller side, who are viewed as being older. Now, the older child is the child who is viewed as being older is always assumed to be able to do more, whereas the child who is viewed as being younger often is frustrated because people don't think they can do as much. I've seen many cases where we have a child who is in the third percentile who's got a good friend with a child who's in the 90th percentile, and people will refuse to believe that they're the same age, even though they could only be a couple of months apart. For you who are going into the field, one of the things you need to do is begin to understand that there is no common height as far as that's concerned. What we are concerned about on these growth charts is if you are meeting basically this curve. What we're concerned with is if you're growing along the curve and then you kind of don't meet the curve, that's a signal to us that we need to start checking something. Is there something wrong? Why has this child gone off the curve? Now, in this case, this is a boy curve. There is examples in your book for both the boys and the females that you want to look in. But notice again, maybe we're going along here and then we stop gaining weight. Well, that would be a sign that maybe something is wrong. Now, one time is not a big deal unless there's a big drop, but if there starts to be a trend that you're not meeting the growth line, then doctors will want to check into why that's occurring. We generally would say breast milk is the best milk for babies to help them grow. However, we also know that not everything can be done by the breast. In some cases, we may have to bottle feed. Now, you can take breast milk and put it into the bottle, and thus you still have breast milk for the bottle. There are advantages and disadvantages to bottle feeding versus breast milk or during breasts. One of the big things with bottle feeding is that this intimacy, this bonding time can occur between the person feeding them and the child. Now, we will learn later on that this is more for the adult or for the person who's doing the feeding than it is for the baby. The baby bonding is just, can you feed me? Because we were talking about infants here. They're not really bonded to a specific person when they're this young. But there are advantages and disadvantages to both. I'm not going to say one is better than the other. What I can say, though, is that we do try to get people who have got lower income to go ahead and breastfeed because there is no cost to that. Once we start having to bottle feed, quite often there are a lot more costs and a lot more inconveniences with that. By the time they're 2, the child's growth is really slowed down, and quite often they become much more finicky about what they want to eat. The good thing is that they still get all their nutrition generally. Mostly what people will say to you if you're talking to some of the experts, which is try to have the widest variety of diet that you can when the child is under 2, because the more they're introduced to new foods and other items, the more likely they'll be eating it when they're 2. So if they eat peas at 1, there's probably probably a good chance they're going to eat peas at 2. The problem is that we tend to maybe not feed the best food when they're younger. A lot of more French fries than we probably should. Maybe a few potato chips we shouldn't feed. I have literally seen people give an 18-month-old some soda. We need to really look at what we're giving our children when they're young so that they build a better appetite as they get older. However, the other thing that you need to remember is that when they hit 2, a lot of changes are happening in their bodies. And so foods that they may have liked before, they don't like now. So they may have liked beets before, and now they don't like beets. And they'll tell you they never liked beets. Well, you have to forgive them a little bit. They're 2 years old. They don't really have the ability for memory, and nor do they really have the ability for time. When they're saying, I never liked beets, they're thinking about right now. I never liked beets right now. This is not anatomy and physiology class, so we're just going to go through this in general just to make sure people have some basic knowledge of this. In the brain, we know that the smallest system that we talk about are neurons. Now, neurons consist of somas, dendrites, axons, and terminal buttons. This is a nice little picture, except for they forgot to mention that the soma is right there in the middle. Um, the axon is basically a cable, and it goes out to these terminal buttons. You have to understand that information flows one way because it's an electrical current. So an electrical current begins to build up here, this charge, and it charges down the axon, and it goes out to the terminal buttons. When that electricity gets out here to the terminal buttons, it stimulates the creation of these things called neurotransmitters. Now, neurotransmitters are really fun little chemicals. They float across the synaptic gap and they go into the next neuron, basically here at the dendrites. Neurotransmitters are exactly what they say. They transmit information from one neuron to the other. And depending on the type of neurotransmitter would depend on the information being transmitted. Serotonin is the happy one. I like serotonin. It makes you feel good. You get it when you eat chocolate and other things, which is one reason why we all should have chocolate every day. But serotonin is the feel-good one. It's the one that can be stimulated if you're depressed. They may give you something to help you increase your serotonin. Neurotransmitters we're going to talk a lot more about as we get further into the text, but we do need to understand that the flow of information is one way. It's electrical within the neuron, it is chemical between the neurons, and this synaptic gap is going to become a very important function, and the receptor sites are going to become more important as we grow. We understand that when we're little, we have very few neurons, and as we begin to grow from infancy through our first year of life, through our third year of life, fourth year of life, we begin to develop a tremendous amount of synapses. Remember, I said our brain is kind of soft and squishy when we start, and now our brain is going to get wired, basically. Specialization in the brain occurs pretty early. We need to begin to organize the brain, you might say, as a newborn. So we see many different things that happen in our newborn stage that we're not going to see later on, such as a great emphasis in electricity in the left side of the hemisphere in response to speech. Now, as we get older, what begins to happen is that we're going to take that area that's going to be dedicated to language, and instead of using electricity all over that brain, we're going to begin to find that it gets narrowed down and narrowed down to the specific area of the brain that's going to be concentrating on language. And thus, other things that might have been there are going to get pushed out. So maybe in the area that we're going to have language, when we were first a newborn, we also had leg movement. Well, leg movement's going to get pushed to someplace else, and that's this area of the brain's only going to be for speech, which also tends to find that that area, that stimulus, will then tend to stimulate that area of the brain to even develop more. What we need to do is wire. Remember the synapses I talked about? Well, we're born with very few synapses, and as we experience things and as we do things, we begin to develop more synapses. We also know that we're going to start on the lower functions of our life, basically our senses and perceptions. And if you think about that, that would be the first things that we need to make sure that we understand and that our brain can function before we start into higher order things like thinking. I basically have to understand eating, I have to understand breathing, I have to understand all those things before I can think about math. Now, environmental stimulation is successful for two kinds of specialization. Both are based on experiences. Now, expectant growth is one where we say we expect every child to be able to do this. So faces are something that every child around the world will begin to experience, and we see a growth of knowledge of what faces are. Now, dependent growth basically says that this is something that's unique to the individual. So in this case, I'm an individual who happens to have a parent who plays music, and so I'm beginning to learn piano. I see my parents play piano, so I experiencing the development of my brain of learning how to play the piano. Now, another child is not going to experience that, thus my brain has got that very specific development. We talked about plasticity before, but let's make sure we remember what plasticity is. It's basically that the brain is very flexible and allows recovery of functions, especially in young children. What we're talking about here is that because the brain hasn't specialized yet, because the brain is still forming, we have the ability, if something goes wrong, to basically have another area of the brain take that over. Now, as we get older, that can be harder to do. So if it's a young child who's had maybe some damage in this case, we say the speech area, we may find another area of the brain takes that responsibility over because it hasn't been formalized. It isn't specialized yet. Whereas with an adult, our brain is already specialized. So if I lose my ability for some speech, I may not have another area of the brain that can take that over. As children, we need to begin to coordinate our skills. And what we're talking about is component skills. And what component skills are little things we need to be able to do before we do the big thing. So we need to be able to sit up. We need to be able to sit by ourselves if we're being held with something before we can sit alone. And that's basically what they're talking about with development over time. We look for these stages or these coordinating component stages, and we need to be able to integrate those together. Now, that can be really difficult. As we say, infants are very top heavy in the beginning, and boy, can they lose their balance. But what's really nice is very quickly we begin to develop our inner ear, we begin to develop some visual cues, and boom, we basically learn balance. And then by 7 months old, most infants can sit up by themselves. Well, the same thing is applied to locomotion. We have little steps that we have to take before we can walk alone. Now, it does say walk alone here at 15 months, and I will usually get somebody who says, well, my child walked at 9 months, or mine did this. Well, we talk about walking in a couple of different ways. There's walking when you're led by the hand, and yeah, we can see kids doing that younger. Generally, when we talk about walking here, we're talking about unsupported, independent walking where they don't fall down after 2 steps, or where they go down because they want to go down, not because they've lost their balance to go down. Generally, this is somewhere between 12 months and 15 months of age. Now, you notice it says walk alone by 15 months. Remember, we talked about that when we see something like that, what we're talking about is that most children by 15 months can do this. However, some children we're going to say are doing this younger, and some children may still be taking this longer. Generally, for almost everything, there's a range of when a child can do this. Now, the reason we say something like walk alone by 15 months, because if they aren't walking alone by 15 months, or they aren't pinchering by 12 months, or they aren't sitting by 7 months, we then want to maybe go in and do a little investigation on why they're not doing that. This becomes a signal that there may be something wrong. It doesn't mean there absolutely is, because remember, babies develop at different rates. And so you could have one child who is just simply taking a little longer to walk. When we say a range, we could take until 18 months to walk. And as long as we're walking by 18 months, we're fine. It's sort of like teeth. Most kids have got teeth before they're 12 months old. However, if you don't have a tooth by the time you're 12 months old, it's still okay. We don't really get worried about not having teeth until you're 14 months old. So, a child who doesn't have any teeth at 12 months, what do they want for their birthday? A tooth. But we're not too worried. We might take x-rays if they haven't showed a tooth by 12 months to make sure that they're forming and that they've had enough calcium and things are going well. These are ranges to help spot if there's a problem. Fine motor skills tend to talk about the hand. And I've made just this nice little chart for you to kind of look at, to kind of understanding some of the skills that you might have at different ages using a rattle. So when we can briefly hold a rattle versus when we can take that rattle and start hitting a cup with it. These are fine motor skills, and we develop them over time. I've always thought it was interesting that about 90% of children prefer their right hand but we really won't know if they're right-handed until basically 9 months, somewhere 8 to 9 months over here. It shows our hand preference. So if we have a child who at 8 or 9 months is still using their left hand all the time, then we may have a lefty. But if your child is 5 months old and they're using their left hand a lot, it doesn't mean they're going to be left-handed. Really won't know until about 9 months. And by the way, handedness can also be a cultural issue. We know that there were a lot more right-handed people in the United States in the 1950s because basically any child who was left-handed was told they had to learn how to be right-handed, and they were taught only to write with their right hand in school. And so many lefties actually turned into being right-handed writers. People like my mother turned out to be ambidextrous. She could write with both her left and her right hand. Now, we also know that culturally, things like cutting your food can be taught differently to different people. In the United States, generally, we use the fork in the right hand. But when we're going to cut meat, what will happen is we'll switch our fork to our left hand and then use the knife in the right hand. What's interesting is that in Europe, the children are not taught to switch their fork around. They keep their fork in their right hand and they're taught to cut with their left hand. It is a skill. You can learn to do it either way, but it is a skill. And so some of these fine motor skills are taught to us. When we talk about handedness, it's taught to us by what is our culture saying. But we're not going to really see generally until about 9 months whether or not a child is going to be a lefty or a righty. And even then, we may have to wait a little bit. Now, some of you have read ahead, and one of the things you may find interesting is that children really don't learn to tie their shoes until about 6 years of age. The funny thing on that one is because children don't tie their shoes until about 6 years of age, and people are looking for things that are more convenient and letting children be more independent, and because parents get tired of tying their child's shoelaces all the time, there are more and more shoes coming out without shoelaces. They're using elastics and other things. Well, this has resulted in that there have been many people growing up to be 18 years of age who really never had to tie shoes because their shoes are already sort of pre-tied. What's funny is that the U.S. Army recently had to add in a workshop on how to tie your shoes because they've had recruits coming in who've never had to tie their shoes. And so they have to teach them how to tie their boots. Another thing that, of course, is happening at this age is getting to understand our smell and taste. And this is all about perception. Now, I'm going to define this word here because sometimes when we use perception, we may be using it in a different way than we might in this class. For us, perception is about processing sensory inputs, and it's receiving, modifying, organizing. But it's all about our sensory inputs. How do we perceive what we see, hear, feel, or touch? That is what it is. And of course, as a little child, as an infant, we're beginning to develop a lot of these things. So how are newborns? Well, newborns are really sensitive to odor. They understand pleasant and unpleasant things. And they're also very sensitive to taste. They can taste the difference even in their mother's breast milk. So if mom's eating a lot of garlic today, baby can tell it, and baby may or may not like it. That's why sometimes you find babies are a little fussy some days about drinking the milk and not drinking the milk. Doesn't happen as much with formula because formula tends to be more formulated, being the same each time, but it's also why babies don't like to change formulas. This is the lemon test down here. It's always kind of fun to watch kids try lemons for the first time. It's a very sour taste, and it ranges from happiness to absolute, ooh, yuck, can't stand it. What are you doing to me? When we talk about pain, we have to talk again about the crying. Crying is just absolutely linked to pain. One of the big things about this is that remember they not soothe very well when they're in pain. And so if you have a baby who is crying and crying and crying, that loud wailing crying or gasping mostly is what you want to watch, and your soothing isn't working, then they may be in pain and it may be time to take them to the doctor. Anybody who's had a baby who's got an earache knows that they just cry because they're in pain. They don't know how else to tell you this. But you do want to begin to understand the difference between the two different cries, pissed off versus pain. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, really recommends that almost all child gets a hearing test within the first month of age. Most kids get their hearings tested right when they're born in the hospital, and these are the little devices they put on them. You can see it's just a little something that goes over the ear. It's a little thing that goes here. This little monitor is saying whether or not the brain is receiving signals from the ear over. They send little tones in. We want babies, of course, to be able to hear. And if for some reason this monitor does not show that they're receiving signals, we're going to want to very quickly begin to do some more testing to see if the problem's within the ear, if the problem's within the brain, is the problem between the connection between the ear and the brain. And the faster we can understand what's wrong, the faster we can come up with therapies or responses to that. But a child who can hear normally, who has no problem with their hearing, generally by 4 months of old, do seem to recognize their own names. So we know that very quickly hearing and that specialization of the brain is taking place. With seeing, one of the interesting things is that we know that newborns are born with these big eyes. And what most people don't realize is that the eyes of a newborn are already 75% of what they're going to be when they're adult. So our eyes don't have a lot more growing to do once we're born. Not only do human babies have this, but we also can see this in the animals of kittens and dogs and many animals. It tends to want to make us want to take care of them. We see them as being vulnerable when they've got those big eyes. So we think in part that development of having these very large eyes, or 75% of our normal size, was a way for babies to get attention. And so it worked well. So it continued to be something that was passed on from generation to generation. We do know that by the time a child is a year old, they basically have the same visual acuity as an adult. But before that, no, not so much. Really, when we're an infant about a month old, we don't see very well at all. 20 feet is about the best we can see. Really, most of our vision between the arm, the nook of the parent who's like holding the child to feed them, and the face is really their best visual area when they're newborns. They can concentrate on that face. It's quite often why they're staring at faces while they're being fed, because they can really see that. And we also know that they're getting their color is developing also over this time. Depth perception is this interesting area. A lot of science has been put into this, and they've done what they call the visual cliff research. And basically, it's a cliff. However, there's a piece of glass that goes over it, and of course, the baby is perfectly safe. Normally, it's red and white. And basically, what they're trying to find out is, when does a baby begin to understand depth? Now, you can see this baby is crawling right across the glass, has no fear. Probably this baby doesn't understand depth at this point. Whereas this child is coming up and going, no, I'm not going any further. It looks like I could fall. Even with encouragement from the parent, the child doesn't move, which means by this time they're beginning to show some fear. And that's generally about 7 months. What's kind of interesting is a lot of that fear also tends to develop about the same time that a child can crawl. This may have been a survival thing to allow children to begin to realize, who are crawling away, that they shouldn't be crawling into holes. Because if we don't have depth perception, we wouldn't know whether or not we could safely crawl somewhere. By the way, I love this little picture from American Science. They put this on there. They actually tested whether or not other animals had the same thing. And we did discover that kittens and other animals did the same thing. At first, they'd walk straight across the glass. And then at some point, they stopped to look over and went, nope, I'm not walking across, because they had a fear of falling. Faces are an interesting thing. When we get to the toy store next week, or whatever week we go, we talk a lot about faces on toys. Why? Because we know that children can begin to understand faces very quickly: the two eyes, the nose, and the mouth. And by 6 months, we can already begin to prototype what a human and a non-human face is. By 6 to 12 months, we actually not only do we understand what faces are, but we begin to recognize the faces that are familiar to us versus the ones that are not familiar. How do we know this? Because we know that children tend to want to look at faces that are familiar to them. Parents' faces, friends' faces, and they tend to look away when it's a face they don't understand or don't know. The last section of the book is kind of an important section. It's one that on the test I asked quite a few questions on. This is about becoming self-aware, and there are kind of three things I want to make sure you get out of this. The first one is, when do we begin to realize that we exist, that face that I see in the mirror is actually me? And toddlers and preschoolers, what are their self-concepts like? How do they define themselves? And when do we begin to acquire something called theory of the mind? When do we begin to relate our thoughts to our actual behaviors? Well, the self-awareness concept and how we developed self-awareness and our belief in this was through this thing called the Red Rouge test. Basically, this was kind of an interesting thing. We have a mirror set up, and the question is whether or not this child could understand who's that in the mirror. When they're younger, they don't get that that's them in the mirror. They think it's another baby, and when that baby smiles, it makes them smile, which makes the baby smile, and it's just a nice, funny round robin. What we did do is we took these babies and the mothers would play with them, the babies would be looking at them, and then somehow, without the baby knowing it, we'd put this red dot on them, either on their nose or their forehead, and the baby would go back to look in the mirror. Now, most babies tried to clean off the red dot from the mirror, meaning is that they thought this other child had a red dot on them. At some point, when we put the red dot on them, in this case there's a red dot on the nose, when the child begins to wipe off their own nose, then we know they understand that face in the mirror is actually them, and that wiping the red dot off of this is not going to help, because that's a reflection. That they want the red dot gone, they have to wipe it off their own nose. That happens somewhere between 15 and 24 months. But by 24 months, most all kids understand that reflection in the mirror is their own. Which means that as toddlers, they begin to want to look at photos of themselves. So photo albums of yourself is something that's really interesting to little kids, because they now understand that person in the picture is me, and they want to see what I looked like when I was a baby. You quite often find them getting very interested in babies and what are babies, because they're beginning to realize that baby, that picture they see, is them. We also begin to see toddlers beginning to use the word I, so they're going to begin to understand that this is them in the picture. I want to do this. I want to do that. But they also tend to show an awareness of the past. I did this yesterday. I did this 2 days ago. So they're beginning to understand that they're in a time frame. They're not so good on future, but they're pretty good with the past. We also know that toddlers are very much into their possessions. Their possessions basically define who they are. I am my possessions are me, which is one reason why the terrible twos are called the terrible twos. They don't like to give things up. With preschoolers, we get a little bit more sophisticated. Generally, preschoolers are older than 2, they're 3 or more, and they do start adding things like physical characteristics in and some preferences. So they may define themselves as a kid who likes SpongeBob and likes this particular blanket. That blanket is mine, and I'm a SpongeBob fan, and I've got dark hair. That may be how they begin to describe themselves. It's really till much more adulthood that we begin to describe ourselves as far as our likes and our beliefs and our values. So little kids, yeah, not there. Basically, it's mine. Now, the theory of the mind says, when do kids begin to understand that their mind is actually controlling their behaviors, and their behaviors are controlled by their mind? And there's sort of a 3-phase approach to this. Notice that phase 1 happens about 2 years of age. Why? Well, we have to get to the point where we're self-aware. Remember, self-awareness happens at 2. So when we become self-aware, we also begin to become aware of desires that are in us. This little voice sort of in our head, or whatever sound that's in their head, that desire, I can actually begin to do something about. So if I desire a cookie, I can speak out that I want that cookie, and maybe I'm going to get that cookie. So I begin to get aware that my mind and my desires, they're all connected, and that I can kind of control things. And by 3, we understand that there's a difference between what I'm mentally thinking versus what's physically happening outside of me. So I will use those words like, I think this, or I believe this. And they understand that just because they think it doesn't mean that it's going to happen. They understand that thinking is inside their head, that voice inside their head is there, not on the outside. By 4 years of old, they begin to know that their behavior can be based on a belief about an event. And what we're talking about here is that if I believe that Christmas. I believe at Christmas I'm going to get happy, and that event is going to cause me to want to jump up and down and run and scream. I understand that. What they also say is that by 4 years of age, we understand even if a belief is false. So if somebody tells you something, we begin to understand that can't be true. So this is the example your book has about the false belief example. This is basically the story that goes on. A little child is told that there is Sally and Annie. Sally has a basket and Annie has a box. Sally decides to put her ball in her basket, and then Sally goes out to play. While Sally is gone, Annie takes the ball out of the basket and puts it in her box, and then Annie decides to go to the kitchen. When Sally comes back in from playing, where will Sally look for the ball? Will she look for the ball in her basket, or will she look for the ball in her box? Now, a young child is going to say she's going to look for the ball in her box because they understand the ball's in the box. What they don't get was that Sally didn't know that. When they get to be about 4 years of age, when asked the same question, they will say Sally will look for the ball in the basket because they understand that that's where Sally last saw it. Thus, that's where Sally probably would go back to look for it because she doesn't know it got changed. So it's kind of interesting, this false belief example, that we take until about 4 years of age to kind of understand that. Well, this is the end to this lecture. I will happily see you in class, and we will move on to the next chapter next week.